A Blueprint for Christian Thought and Living. Foundational Dichotomies. Welcome back to our video series that illustrates the big picture of Christian thought and living. We continue in this video using the construction of a house as an analogy to explore the overall structure of Christian thought. The house consists of three major phases, and these are the foundation work, the framework, and the finishing work. It's worth noting that these three phases make up the entire structure of the gospel, and likewise Christian theology. This second video evaluates what phase 1, the foundation of our structure, contains. The concrete dichotomies of either-ors are the exclusive elements of the foundation of Christian thought. These either-ors are contrasts between spiritual personages. The Creator does not equal the creature. They stand in absolute contrast to one another in every way. They are absolute diametric polarities, ultimate incongruities, between whom there is no middle ground, no neutral ground, no third option. They are completely incompatible with one another. There is no stalemate between them. They stand as far apart from one another as east does from west. These beings are separated dualities, not equal opposite forces, not dualisms. Christian thought is foundationally contrary to all dualistic thought. There is but one reason that these either-ors are diametric polarities and not comparable dualisms. And the reason is because God alone is exclusively both the beginning and the end of everything. Nothing else is like him in any way. He is totally other, an absolute, intrinsic being, separate and independent from everything else, utterly unique. God alone is the singular beginning and the singular end of everything. As the beginning, God's presence is singular in that He alone is the I Am, self-existent, uncreated, uncaused cause of all things. The Alpha, self-starter. The Almighty, ultimate power. The beginning, without beginning. The Creator, not self-generated, source of all existence. The sovereign being, supreme, self-governing Lord and anchor of all things. And God alone is the singular end. God's purpose is singular, in that He alone is the end, conclusion of all, the Omega, purpose of all, the sum, good towards which all things work, the consummation, who will subdue and overcome all that is opposed to Him, who is the victor that will prevail over all. Nothing can stand equal in opposition to Him. He has no equal. There is no other beginning or end but God alone. All Christian thought commences with the singularity of presence and purpose of God, in that He is never second, never equal to, nothing compares to or is compatible with Him, who is the supreme creator that created all things, lesser to and dependent upon Himself, who is the God who always was and will always be, by and for whom all things exist, were created. He alone is glorious, a glory of being that nothing or no one else inherently possesses. What God is, only God is. What God does, only God does. God alone is good, knows good, and does good. All Christian thought is exclusively founded upon God's being alone. Everyone and everything stands in absolute contrast to His being and doing. No one and no thing is comparable to Him. This firm foundation of Christian thought is built on the bedrock of God's self-revelation of His being. Upon this bedrock of divine self-revelation, we can hope to then establish a secure foundation upon which we can construct a stable Christian theological framework, and in turn experience a consistent Christian life, the finishing work of Christ, His personal presence and working. So then, the only things we can truly know about God personally are what God self reveals. God determines our understanding of Himself by His own self-revelation. And most importantly, God has self-revealed and self-expressed Himself, particularly in His Son Jesus Christ, who is God's eternal Word that was expressed in the flesh within time and space. It is critical to grasp that God cannot be personally known by mere natural human reasoning that expects to self-discover Him through mere physical or metaphysical means. We will now briefly glance at why scientific exploration and philosophical explanations are insufficient means of personally knowing God. Science must stay in its lane in order to remain true to the scientific objective of seeking to know and perceive within the limited and fixed parameters of a space-time context. And science must admit and accept considerations that transcend its own comprehension and exploration, which is restricted to evaluating only natural phenomena. Nor can God be personally known through philosophical explanation, which attempts to explain God by reasoning Him into being, by mere human logic that seeks to discover His attributes. Christian thought, consistently derived from God's self-revelation, scandalizes mere human thought by failing to stay within the limits of the logic tests of mere human rationale. Mere human reasoning depends upon objective and empirical parameters, which cannot allow the illogic of paradox inherent in Christian thought, which is the essential truth of all things Christian, the gospel, God's self-revelation in Jesus Christ. The gospel alone is the absolute paradox, a tensioned dialectic, which is illogical, unacceptable, absurd, and offensive to mere human understanding. When confronted with the gospel, mere human logic struggles to accept its own limitations of being trapped within a cranial thought box. Due to the realities of either-or dichotomies, human reason collides with the transcendent self-revelation of God, who created human reasoning. This theologic of self-revelation first exhausts all human reason, and then allows the doubts of human reason to become part of the foundation for faith. The epistemological, static logic of man cannot perceive what the ontological, dynamic light of God can provide, reveal. Christian faith transcends intellect alone by acknowledging that the transcendent God becomes immanently expressed within His creation. Subjective faith receptivity experiences the objective revelation of God's person in Jesus Christ. Faith results in humility that recognizes our inability of comprehension, which collapses in worship of the revealed one, in whom ultimate knowledge and reality abide. Those who adhere to mere belief, which is based upon empirical evidence evaluated by human logic as the sole basis of knowledge, fundamentalist theologians and empiricist logicians, apologists, will struggle to enter the theologic of the kingdom of God. God. Science can't compute Him. Philosophy can't comprehend Him. Politics can't control Him. And religion can't communicate Him. Though there is a natural revelation of God in creation, there is no such thing as natural theology. Natural revelation alone, and the so-called natural theology of religion, based upon such, will never bring science or philosophy to the recognition of the greater understanding that only God can provide by His personal self-revelation. For example, human logic would never figure out Trinitarian monotheism, and human logic would never conclude God's being as a divine relationality of love. Human logic could not deduce that God's being is the very essence of love itself, that He is a perfect and ultimate personal relationship of three in oneness, that He is a singular being in whom love, otherness, constantly, eternally, flows from each one of the three persons to the other two, that His being is not a static existence, but a dynamic being, wherein love is continually, eternally, expressed in triune action within His singular being. Every single act of this infinite singular being consists of His personal presence in the expression of His triune self. Where God acts, God is. God is triune in all His acts. God's being is never separated from God's doing. God does not dispense blessings as commodities and benefits, but is in Himself the only blessing He gives. He is the personal revelation and manifestation of eternal and infinite love. What God does, only God does. In self-revelation, God reveals that He alone is who He is. Independent in being from anything else. Eternal in existence before anything else was. Holy in being, set apart and separated from anything else. And infinite in being, greater than anything else. In self-revelation, God reveals that He always acts in character and never out of character. He does what he does because he is who he is. All of God's acts are contingent upon God's being, as self-generated, self-revealing, and personal self-manifestations. Divine triune being always and alone drives divine doing. In self-revelation, God reveals himself as the original and ultimate being. All other being and beings are derived from him, ek theos, out of God. Nothing and no one else possesses an inherent value, being, or essence but God. He created all other things and beings. He created them as creatures entirely dependent upon his personal being and doing. Spirit beings, angelic beings, were the first other beings he created. They were created as free choosing creatures per God, who in himself alone has free will. This necessitated God's self-limitation of his own absolute sovereign control, which allows angelic creatures to have legitimate freedom of choice. Our next video in the series will discuss the essential constitutional differences between God and angels. This will be the first of several foundational dichotomies that we will be discussing in this series of videos.